Great, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I spoke at the inaugural conference of BAVS back in 2000, around the M25 at Hertfordshire. So 18 years on, I've had a bit of time to think about what to speak about next. Now, on the eve of another royal wedding, you might be forgiven for thinking that there isn't anything more to be said about Queen Victoria. We sit through an incessant and predictable media diet of Victoria and Albert and Victoria and Abdul. Even Victoria's own diet, actually that's a mighty fine book, has been served up as historical fare. Is there no end to romancing the throne, one may ask? It's a serious point because the scholarly approach to monarchy, which applies across virtually every other period of British history, including the present reign, is seldom extended to Queen Victoria. It is the age she eponymizes to which we are drawn, and not the Queen herself. Our hosts today pursue Victorian studies. They seldom get into the study of Queen Victoria. The centenary of her death in 2001 proves the point. Sorry, a bit of self-plug there, but it was the Victorians who were subject to scrutiny in 2001, not the Queen. But as we approach next year's bicentenary of her birth, surely it's time to place her back at the centre. And that's what I want to try and set out, following Kirsty's talk in a slightly polemical fashion in my talk today. I want to look at some of the obstacles in the way of our taking Queen Victoria seriously as scholars and some of the ways forward. And I want to focus in particular on three spheres, three aspects of her reign. Queen Victoria as a woman, Queen Victoria as a dynast, and finally Queen Victoria as a constitutional monarch, this issue of her prerogative and what she did with it. And as I say, I want to look at some of the ways in which the historiography has been unhelpful to us taking forward that agenda, and some of the more recent work that suggests ways in which we can go forward. Let me start with the previous centenary of her birth. Lytton Strachey has a great deal to answer for anybody working on Victorian studies, and of course that applies to the study of Queen Victoria herself. His centenary work on Queen Victoria, published a year after eminent Victorians, proved as savage and severe on the Queen as he had on the rest of her subjects, accusing her of the same kind of anxiety, doubt and prudishness as the population at large. This curious age which thought it was modern, but by 1918 looked very unmodern indeed. Now Strachey, it's an interesting account because in my opinion, he throws in quite a lot of misogyny as well. He argues that the Queen grew up entirely in a female world, a world of governesses, female courtiers and servants, devoid of the masculine touch that would have prepared her properly for serving the nation. That only came when she became Queen. Of course, she didn't know she was going to become Queen until 1830, when a bad old King of Hanover was finally taken out of the succession. But it's a tag that stuck, that this is a very feminine Queen, stuck in the separate spheres, so familiar from the Victorian period. Someone who herself seems to have had very unmodern, very unprogressive views on female equality, set out in this famous citation, famous because it's the only citation where she ever says anything about the women's question, in 1870, when she dismisses Lady Amberley, who's getting involved in a suffrage society down in Bristol. And as Dorothy Thompson showed brilliantly many years ago, and more recently the work of Ariane Chernock has shown, there's this huge gulf of power, a huge gulf between Queen Victoria as the most powerful monarch in Europe to a certain extent, and someone as a woman who accepts second-class citizenship. We have to deal with this because in her lifetime, Queen Victoria had iconic status as a woman, not as a progressive woman, but as someone who empowered those who sought political and civil rights. And if you want a very meaningful evidence of that, take a look at this meeting of suffragettes around 1911. It's been coloured up, but it is an original picture, and there she is on the banner of one of the WSPU supporters, Queen Victoria, Queen Mother. Indeed, from Harriet Taylor's article, signed off by John Stuart Mill, of course, in 1851 in the Westminster Review, through to the campaigns of the WSPU, Queen Victoria is referred to as a mother figure. If we have a woman on the throne of England, then why can't we extend enfranchisement in other areas? We can see this role of Queen Victoria as totemic at the time of her 1887 Jubilee, when the Women's Jubilee Fund, with 3 million signatures, provides a range of memorials to, well, she wanted one to Albert, other people wanted to spend it on schools and hospitals, not just from the four nations, but from around the world. Going back to that suffragette image, you can also see this image of the Queen as Boudicca, Boadicea, the warrior queen, someone who's associated with the army, with military culture, with the senior command of the army. Her cousin, the Duke of Cambridge, of course, is in charge of the armed forces. It's a dimension of Queen Victoria's statecraft, this warrior queen, to use Walter Arnstein's phrase, which has been neglected and I think misunderstood. But it's as an icon of remote justice that I find her particularly interesting. Whether one goes to the other end of the world, to Ohanimutu in New Zealand, where there's a Maori memorial to Queen Victoria, or one goes to the area of my own recent interest, to India, one sees all the time this sense in which Queen Victoria is looked to as someone who is a beneficent and a just ruler who can be appealed to by people who lack the kind of political rights that are enjoyed back in Britain. In India too, we see a totemic status around her persona as a widow. We go from popular biographies which see her as the young queen, but reset in an Indian setting. For example, Thomas Sully's famous portrait of the Queen here in 1837 is, I think, rejigged and given an Indian twist in this picture of her as more like an Indian Maharani in the 1890s. From the same book, we see another picture twisted to show Queen Victoria as the grieving widow, and this persona of Queen Victoria's widow is a very dominant one in India by the late 19th century. So in these ways, and in the Indian case, you can see it written into the agendas of nationalism of groups such as the Indian National Congress. In these ways, Queen Victoria as a woman is exemplary, but not in the ways that we expect her to be exemplary. She's not there as a progressive supporter of equality, but she is there signalling the kind of power and justice that is associated with, and beneficence, which is associated with female sovereignty. Let me turn to a second theme I want to look at, the theme of Queen Victoria as the head of a large dynasty. We associate that particularly, here's one of the last grainy photographs of the royal family shortly before Albert's death in the late 1850s. We associate Queen Victoria's family dimension with domesticity, with Walter Bagehot's famous phrase, the idea of a family on the throne. We have classic studies, particularly by John Plunkett and by Margaret Homans, showing how Victoria and Albert themselves fashioned the idea of domesticity for the Victorians, their emphasis on homeschooling, on Christmas, on a kind of gendered public service and philanthropy for their children. They seem the very embodiment of Victorian values. And sometimes the historiography doesn't even get that sophisticated. Prince Albert is simply seen as a one-man stud farm, siring 9 children in 17 years before his death, presumably of exhaustion in 1861. But let's look at it a bit more closely. Here we've fast forward to the 1890s and we see 3 generations, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and something remarkable is going on, akin to the monarchs of early modern Europe, the monarchs even of the late medieval period. This is dynastic marriage making, which makes the Tudors and Stuarts look like amateurs. This is the British royal family working its way into the continental courts as far wide as Moscow and even beyond Europe as well. And I would argue that if we talk about the concert of Europe in 1914, this remarkable phenomenon of international relations, which with the Crimea War aside keeps the peace for a century, then in that orchestra we have a lot of royals. Our soloists are Metternich and Talleyrand and Thiers and Bismarck and Disraeli, but the royals were there at the heart, playing the instruments and keeping it all going. And that, of course, has a global side to it. It goes beyond Europe, and the royal family were very involved in this. Queen Victoria dispatched her sons around the world. The Prince of Wales famously to India in 1875-6. Here he is entering Jaipur, which had been painted pink for the occasion, pink to this day. Here's his younger brother, Arthur, later the Duke of Connaught, who was also at the Battle of El Tabir, heading an Indian regiment in Canada. And of course the Duke of Edinburgh goes to New Zealand and Australia, where there's an attempted assassination. Now we think of this as show, as symbolism, as theatre. They were going with diplomatic briefs. The Prince of Wales intervened in the Baroda dispute, a particularly sensitive issue. The Duke of Edinburgh intervened in the Maori Wars, 1867, 1868. The Duke of Connaught was drawn into negotiations with the Emir of Afghanistan at Rawalpindi in 1885. So Victoria belonged with her family to a world of international relations in which monarchs still played a huge part, as recent work on the international system by Merrens and by Frank Muller at St Andrews has shown. Let me turn finally to that issue around prerogative. Because another sphere of the 19th century from which Queen Victoria is always excluded is the politics and the constitutional issues of the day. Again, Walter Bagehot led the way in his classic account of 1867 on the English Constitution, writing at the time when the monarch was absent from everything because of her great grief after the death of Albert. And he offered the classic definition of the constitutional monarch, there to warn, there to advise, there to counsel, but not to intervene. Well, that was news to Queen Victoria because she tried to intervene in every single way. And actually, if we go back to the issue of prerogative, we actually see her exercising a great deal of power, not the kind of minimal power that is insisted upon not only by the constitutional legal historians, but also by all of those who believe in the theatre of monarchy in the 19th century. David Canadyne's ornamentalism, William Coon's democratic royalism, more recently Andrei Aleknovich's work on 19th century monarchy. But her powers of prerogative were considerable. Here she is, addressing her first Privy Council in 1837, captured in a famous painter by Sir David Wilkie. Well, she went on to address Privy Councils every month for the whole of her reign. The last one was the 12th of November, 1900, when she was 2 months out from passing. And if we look at these occasions, they're not simply rubber stamping what her ministers have brought to her. There's a great deal of politicking going on around these meetings. What's said in the meeting is interesting, but what goes on around the meetings is much more revealing. If we look at another constitutional role she performs, the state opening of Parliament, she does that every year, except for the famous few years in the 1860s when she's too sad, too grief-bound to do it. She starts in November 37, last open state opening of Parliament in October 1900. It seems to confirm her quiescence in a ceremony in which she ventriloquizes herself. It's the Queen's speech, she says it, but it's not her words. But actually, if you go back and look in detail, often it is her words. She has said to Mr. Gladstone, she has said to Mr. Disraeli, this is what I want in the Queen's speech, or this is what I don't want in the Queen's speech. And there are plenty of examples. For example, it's she in 1875 who insists on putting Britain's response to the Indian famine into the Queen's speech. It's she in 1881 who insists on the retreat from Kandahar in Afghanistan of not being put into the Queen's speech. And there's evidence, not just from India, but from other parts of her statecraft as well. And finally, an important part of her prerogative that nobody is interested in is in her role as head of the Church of England. Now, I know God is meant to be the head, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, but in real terms, it's Queen Victoria who is head of the Church of England, defender of the faith, Fidei Defensor, 1534. And boy, does she believe in it. She believes it's a very important part of her statecraft, her prerogative in appointing, approving bishops, both at home and abroad. The first part of her reign, along with Prince Albert, she's very evangelical. She believes in conversion overseas. She appoints bishops to India, to Melanesia, to South Africa, who are backed by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel overseas and whose mission is to convert. That all changes in the 1850s, partly the result of the Maori Wars in New Zealand, the Indian Rebellion, some of the indigenous people's responses in southern Africa. She becomes much more ecumenical. She becomes less evangelical as her reign goes on. She ends up supporting, for example, Bishop Colenso in Natal, who literally goes native in the sense that he becomes an advocate of native rights. She opposes the work of missionaries in India, particularly their campaigns to wrench open the zenana, the perjured status of many Hindu and Muslim women. And we can see this, we can plot this in the very specific advice that she gives about which churchmen should be made bishops and which churchmen should be held back. And, well, there you can see it, church and state, and she's in front of it all. So let me conclude this very brief and, I hope, sufficiently provocative talk with a request that next year we put Queen Victoria back into Victorian Studies, as I've tried to do, plug in my book, which is coming out in August, in relation to India. And I think that there are three things that we need to do. We do need to assert her agency. I think we need to move beyond the very impressive wave of cultural history of Queen Victoria that we have had, but which kind of tends to leave her silent and leaves her out of it. We now have an abundance of information about her. I know they're heavily doctored, but the journals that are online are a superb fount of information about the whole of her reign. And the letters, similarly doctored and edited around the time of Lytton Strachey writing, they also contain much information on a day-to-day basis about the work of the Queen. Secondly, I think we need to appreciate the variety of feminine identities and personae that Queen Victoria represented in the period. We shouldn't just be looking for those which seem most familiar. We should be looking for others which say something more about older versions of monarchy that persist from the 18th into the 19th century. And finally, with all due respect to the Four Nations issue, I think we need to go beyond the Four Nations and think about Queen Victoria in a global way, because she was the most iconic person of the 19th century. She was the most reproduced, reprinted, photographed, depicted person around the world. And if what I found in India is anything to go on, that is a story that needs to be told in other parts of the globe as well. Thank you all for listening today.